The night of September 11th was meant to be one of celebration. Inside a high-rise apartment overlooking the sleepless city, music pulsed, glasses clinked, and laughter spilled out onto the balcony. Menglong had invited friends and colleagues into his private world, offering them a glimpse of the glittering life he carried so easily. He was a star in full bloom. Career ascending, his smile radiant. No one who attended that party could have guessed that the night would end in darkness. That the man who toasted with them would soon be lying lifeless in the courtyard below. In the days that followed, the first headlines were blunt and tragic: a suicide. Another celebrity swallowed by the loneliness of fame. Newspapers filled their columns with speculation about hidden sadness, while fans lit candles and wept for an idol they believed had chosen to step off the edge. The narrative was convenient, almost too neat. But it was also wrong. When investigators walked through the apartment, they saw what reporters missed. They saw bruises that did not belong to a simple fall. They saw the empty room, the absence of witnesses, faint marks on the balcony railing. They saw contradictions in the only story that existed. A story told by the last man to see Menglong alive, Zhang Yuxuan. At first Zhang spoke calmly, almost casually, as though what had happened were nothing more than an unfortunate accident at the end of a drunken evening. We argued. He was drunk. He shouted at me. I just pushed him back. He lost balance. He fell. A push. Just a push, that was the word he clung to. But the body on the autopsy table told another story. There were bruises on the arms and shoulders, deep enough to reveal force, grip, resistance. They were not the marks of a man who slipped, they were the marks of a man shoved. Still, Zhang repeated himself. He screamed, it was loud. Then it stopped. That's all. He said it like one might describe a slammed door or a dropped glass. His words carried no weight of regret, no trembling of grief, only the flat acknowledgement of noise abruptly silenced. The police began to reconstruct the scene using his own description. They placed a mannequin on the balcony, positioned just where Menglong had stood. An officer, playing Zhang, pressed against the shoulder, mimicking the gesture of a push. The mannequin toppled over the railing, falling into the emptiness below. The thud that followed was hollow, chilling, like a ghostly echo of the real impact that had ended her life. Reporters present described the air as frozen in that moment. One detective whispered, if this was just a push, it was a push that killed. Zhang's story twisted each time it was challenged. When asked again, he claimed you had slipped without contact. He was too drunk, he stumbled. I didn't touch him. But confronted with the photographs of bruises, he backtracked to his earlier version. Fine. I pushed him, but not hard. He couldn't even stand. The contradictions betrayed him. If Menglong could not stand, how could he have lunged, shouted? What? And if Zhang never touched him, what explained the fingerprint-shaped marks etched into his skin? Each new answer undermined the last, until all that remained was the single undeniable truth that Menglong had not jumped of his own will. What made the case more haunting was the silence of the night. The time Menglong fell, the party had ended, the guests gone. Only Zhang remained. No one else heard the argument. No one else saw the push. No one else could contradict or confirm his words. The truth was locked inside the man who stood over his friend one moment and then stared down at his broken body the next. Investigators turned to the only testimony available, Zhang's own voice. They listened to his phrases, corrected the tone, studied the pauses. They examined the bruises, measured the force required, compared it with a casual dismissal of just a push. Forensic experts concluded that Menglong, with stimulants and alcohol flooding his body, had been in no state to resist. He was vulnerable, incapacitated. A man whose final moments were dictated by the strength of another's hands. The suicide narrative collapsed under the weight of these discoveries. He shifted the story. It was no longer a tragic accident. No longer the sorrowful decision of a celebrity weary of the spotlight. It was violence. It was confrontation. It was murder disguised as despair. The most haunting detail remained the scream. Detectives reported that when they reenacted the fall, they simulated the sound of a man crying out as he plummeted. Even as a recording, even as artifice. It chilled the room. Journalists stiffened. Officers looked away. It was the auditory shadow of the truth. Menglong's last defiance against the silence of death. When Zhang was asked whether the sound resembled what he heard, he shrugged. Yes. He screamed. Then it stopped. Those words, repeated with such indifference, carried more weight than any confession. They were not the words of a man haunted by guilt but of someone describing an inconvenience, an interruption, a noise that had ended. For simplicity, they condemned him. What happened that night was not the quiet exit of a troubled man but the violent finale of an argument that spiraled into brutality. The star who once lit up stages ended in darkness. Not by his own choosing but by the force of another. The echo of whose scream remains. Uttering the neat lies. Cutting through the silence. To be buried. This is only the beginning. The question that remains is not whether Zhang Yuxuan pushed Yu Menglong. That truth is written in bruises, in contradictions. In the hollow echo of the fall. The question that looms now is why. What rivalry, what fury, what hidden shadow drove him to lay hands on the friend who trusted him? And how did his own cold words become the very evidence that unmasked him? The answers lie not in the night of the party. Sterile light of interrogation rooms. In the reenactments staged by detectives. In the forensic reports that strip away denial. As the investigation deepens. As the voice of Zhang Yuxuan tells more than he intends. The story of Yu Menglong's last night turns darker still. The interrogation room was small. With a single overhead lamp that seemed to stretch the silence into something unbearable. Zhang Yuxuan sat with his back straight. Eyes cast down at the table. He did not fidget. He did not sweat. He spoke when asked, and when he did. His words were clipped. Stripped of emotion. The officers across from him. It was not the usual image of a man mourning the sudden death of a friend. It was the image of a man who had grown accustomed to denial. We argued. He was too drunk. He started yelling. He repeated. I pushed him. Screamed. Then he was gone. The detective leaned forward. Call it a push. But these bruises, he slid photographs across the table. Images of livid marks on Yu Menglong's body. These don't come from a gentle shove. They come from force. From violence. Zhang's eyes lingered on the photos only for a moment. Then he shrugged. He was weak. His body was unstable. Even a small push left marks. It wasn't murder. It was an accident. But his words rang hollow. Forensic experts had already testified that the bruises were consistent with being gripped tightly. Consistent with restraint. Consistent with resistance that had been overpowered. They were not the random bruises of a drunken fool. They were the physical signatures of an assault. When police pressed further, Zhang shifted again. Maybe I grabbed him, he admitted. Maybe I held him back before he fell. But I didn't throw him. I didn't mean for him to go over. Each variation of his account added another crack in his defense. If he had never touched Yu Menglong, how could he now be admitting to grabbing him? If he had only pushed gently, how could his fingers leave deep marks? His words were a net tightening around himself. Each strand drawn from his own mouth. The part was not just what he said but how he said it. Officers described his tone as cold, indifferent, almost bored. He was screaming. It was loud, then it stopped. The line repeated itself again and again, as if it were the only memory Zhang allowed himself to hold on to. The scream itself were nothing more than a sound that had briefly interrupted the night. Investigators returned to the apartment to test his story against reality. They measured the balcony railing, the angle of the fall, space where two men might have struggled. They brought in forensic mannequins, replayed the scene according to Zhang's sparse details. In every scenario, Yu Menglong did not simply slip. He was propelled. The distance of his fall, the way his body landed, the bruises on his frame, all told the same story. And had forced him over. When they showed Zhang the reenactment, he was asked again if it resembled what happened. He nodded once. Yes. He leaned back. I touched him. Over. He screamed. His flatness was more damning than tears would have been. He did not fight the imagery, he accepted it. With the detachment of a man describing a memory he wished to minimize but could not erase. The police knew then that the confession they needed was not going to arrive in the form of a clear admission of guilt. It was already there. Scattered in fragments. Wrapped in evasion. Words betrayed him. The more he tried to reduce his role, the more the evidence around those words grew sharper. He wanted to call it an accident, a stumble. Push too small to matter. But he could not erase the scream. That final cry. He described so carelessly. Was the living testimony of murder. The toxicology report confirmed what detectives had suspected. Menglong's body was flooded with stimulants and alcohol, enough to weaken his reflexes, blur his balance. All his defenses. He could not have fought back. He could not have resisted. He was not a man who leapt willingly, he was a man whose body was already failing him, who was thrust into the night with no chance to survive. His lawyers argued that he had panicked, that his client had been caught in a moment of reckless anger, that he never intended harm. But the bruises suggested control. The reenactment suggested intention. The silence after the scream suggested indifference. When the case was presented to the public, the shift in perception was seismic. Fans who had mourned a supposed suicide were now faced with a murder. They learned that their idol had not chosen despair but had been betrayed by the very person who claimed to be his closest friend. The outrage was immediate. The grief doubled. He didn't fall. One fan wrote on social media, "He was pushed. And his screams will never leave us." The police, in their official report, described the reconstruction as a turning point. The enactment made clear what words could not. It read, "Fall was not voluntary. The scream was not a choice. It was the sound of life taken by another's hand." In court, when the prosecution repeated Zhang's own words, "He screamed," then it stopped. The room was so quiet that even the reporters' pens seemed frozen above their notepads. Those words, spoken with such emptiness, become the most powerful evidence of all. They painted the scene more vividly than any witness could have. The killer himself had narrated the murder. To Menglong's family, the pain was unbearable. Told to believe in a suicide, to swallow the narrative that he had chosen death. Now they were forced to relive the night through the sterile, cruel words of the man who had been with him in his last moments. Their son's life had not been surrendered, it had been stolen. His final cries had not been cries of surrender, but of desperation, terror, agony. Zhang Yuxuan sat through the proceedings without visible emotion. His face remained calm. Even as photos of the body were displayed. Even as the scream was invoked again and again. When asked if he regretted anything, the response was chillingly simple, "I wish he hadn't screamed." That's what everyone remembers. And indeed, that is what remains. The scream. Not the laughter at the party. Not the clinking of glasses. Not the music that filled the room hours before. The scream that shattered the silence. The scream that stripped away the lie of suicide. The scream that revealed the truth of a murder. When police returned to the apartment one final time, they stood on the balcony in silence. One officer later admitted, "You can almost hear it if you stand there." The sound of him going over. The sound of that scream. It has become, in their words, not just an echo but a warning, that behind every convenient story of despair may lie a darker truth, waiting for the silence to break. The case closed not with a dramatic confession, but with a slow unraveling of a man who thought his denial would shield him. Zhang Yuxuan's words were his undoing. His cold recounting of the scream became the evidence that could not be refuted. The sound that proved intent. The noise that shattered the illusion of innocence. And so the story ends where it began. With a voice tearing through the night. Menglong's final screams did not vanish into darkness. They endure. Echoing through courtrooms, through headlines. Through the memory of those who now know the truth. They are the sound of life ending unjustly. The sound of silence breaking forever. They are the sound that exposed the hand that pushed him.